This is House Planning Help episode 161. Hello there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Today, it's a solo session as I discuss what I've learned through the process of hiring an architect. Quick point on this episode that I will probably say I this, I that, I the other, when really throughout this I mean we, although sometimes I will be meaning I. So I think I'm just going to stick to I, hopefully see where I'm coming from. I am talking about my wife and I and the decisions we made, but I think just for this episode it's simpler if I say I. Before we move on, I want to tell you about my first talks of 2017. I'm heading back to the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre for 2 days at the end of this week, if you're listening to this at the time that we've published the episode, so the 27th and the 29th of January 2017. Always fun to get down there and to meet people, also to hear the questions. That's something that I really enjoy, and this is their biggest show of the year, the first one, the winter show. I think by the time it gets to the summer, people have a million things that they could be off and doing, but this one is definitely one to go to. Perhaps it's one of those dark winter days and you want to get out, explore your self-build a little bit more and learn a few bits and pieces. Loads of stuff happening at the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre. We'll link in their website into the show notes today. And also, if this has been and gone now, just remember houseplanninghelp.com/events will have the latest bits and pieces where I will be heading, or perhaps it's an event that we're holding a meetup. That is the place to find it. So we'll put that in today's show notes too. This podcast is not so much how to find an architect as how I found my architect. And I thought it was important to stress that. We have actually had a conversation with Adrian Dobson from the Royal Institute of British Architects. That's episode 118, where we talked about how you find an architect. This is just my take on it. It's in no way comprehensive, just a few things that I've noticed through the process. Also, I think sometimes it depends on where you come from as to what process you go through. And as you'll discover, I suppose I'm slightly different from most because little by little, I've become more ingrained in the construction industry. So when it started out, let's rewind the clock, 2012, that was the first time when I thought, I'd really like to build a house. I'm going to learn about it. And also, really, I want to put my video production business heading in that direction, trying to help green builders. I set up Regen Media, and we've just grown organically year by year, and I've tried to get to know some of those people. So probably before I started the podcast, I went to my first AECB conference. It was a recommendation from someone that I'd met who said, oh, you ought to go down this, sounds like it's just up your street. And they were right. However, this was for people in the construction industry. So my point here is one of networking. And you just can't network in 5 minutes. It takes time. And actually being stuck on my own project and thinking, oh, I wish it would move on, I just continued this networking and speaking to people. Then, as I mentioned, through Regen Media, for example, being affiliated with the Passivhaus Trust for the UK Passivhaus Awards, or helping them on other projects, has just been great because, of course, I get to go out and see some of these projects. And in doing that, I meet the people, I hear all of the stories, put together videos, and sometimes that is a great learning opportunity in itself, and find out various different things. So all of this, I'm saying, is actually a great foundation of when it comes to the time of needing to select an architect, the hard work had already been done. Now, as I was saying, I'm not necessarily sure that you can repeat what I've done. That's fine. But just that same idea of there are places where you can interact with architects and builders, or even if you go to, say, for example, the Passivhaus Open Days. I love supporting this because I think it's so good. You go to a self-builder's house, you check it out, or it might be some other project, and you're under no pressure. No one's going to try and sell you anything. Go around there, just get a feel for it, ask some questions. Sometimes the architect will be there too. But this is just an opportunity to meet, and you never know when the next time is that you might meet these people you can make a note of if you like that architect, and perhaps you'll bump into them somewhere else. But the more interactions you can have, both just in conversation with those sorts of people, with other people. This is one thing that I'm trying to create in the hub too, is just some interactions, and just keep on moving down the field, even if you feel like you're not getting anywhere. Does that make sense? As my first brilliant point, just engaging with construction folk at every opportunity. And I'll go actually one step further. There came to a point when I was pretty clear on my brief was going to be Passivhaus standard. I wanted to get there. So I know at that point that maybe I should keep an eye on the Passivhaus Trust events that are coming up, because that might be a good place to eventually find an architect. As I said, all of this was happening at a subliminal level, so I didn't have to work very hard. My next point is actually, again, something that may be personal to me. I don't know. I like trusting my gut feeling. It's something I've always enjoyed doing. I don't stress over things too much. I just collect information where I need to, give it a little bit of time, but not too much. Make a decision, stick to it, learn from it if it all goes pear-shaped. And that has served me very well. And for this decision too, that was exactly the route that I wanted to go down. So without much deliberation, I was able to come up with my shortlist. And on it were eco-design consultants, good architecture, and Parsons and Whitley. So all of these companies I know well. Either I've had lots of interaction with the people that run them. I might have seen case studies at various conferences, so I know their buildings well, or I might have filmed with them, been out on site, just checked the buildings, hear the stories, and that is just great because I get a feeling of what it's like. And I think the step that you would probably take would be visiting projects via the architect, but I feel like I didn't have to make that step as much just because of where I've come from and that experience of meeting these people little by little. So that's my shortlist. Of course, there are lots of criteria when you consider an architect, and I want to pick up with just perhaps 3 things at the top of the list. I'm saying great design is a given. You're selecting an architect, so that is something I expect. However, Passivhaus experience, someone who's been there and done it, who really understands it. I don't particularly want to be on the learning curve. That was important on this project. Second point, I was also keen to choose someone who was local. I'm not sure whether this is essential. I know in this day and age you can work remotely, and perhaps with a couple of site visits everything would be okay. But there was just something in my mind that the ability to get to site fairly quickly and to have someone that, if we just felt, look, let's have an in-person meeting, it'd be a lot easier. People who work in this area. And again, that was in part why those 3 were shortlisted. The other aspect being the working relationship. These are all people that I've engaged with a lot. And sometimes I have actually seen projects which I thought, oh, this architect is really talented. But you know what? I can hear some of the other stories. Perhaps they're not being nice to their staff, or they just go through a million different clients and things like that. That just doesn't feel like the sort of people that I want to work with. And if I'd chosen any one of these 3 on my shortlist, I'm pretty confident the outcome would have been good. Of course, it would be different. This isn't sliding doors. I can't play out all these eventualities. And that actually was a much tougher thing, was picking 1 from 3. Narrowing it down to 3, I could have picked another 3 actually. I ruled out London as a place that I didn't want to get involved with. There were lots of other people there I could have chosen, but I just thought perhaps I'm going to be paying London prices. It's also very difficult to get out of London and to get to the site and so forth. So I just wanted people more in the immediate area or who have some knowledge of this area. The process that we went through, we took them to site, had a look around, heard some of their ideas, just explained the basics of some of the things that we would like. And it was fascinating to me that I think I'm right in saying it. When you try and remember back, or certainly with my memory, they all suggested upside down houses. So that was quite interesting, that from seeing the site, perhaps that would make sense. We had a chat and a coffee somewhere else afterwards, and I was struck by the question, what build route are you going down? That again was a common question which now seems totally logical. At the time I was thinking, why are you asking that? Why is that important in this conversation? Also, perhaps in an imaginary world, I expect that this part of the process is they sketch out some designs and send it back, and on that basis we decide which architect we're going with. Of course, that's not what's really happening here. They're putting together a short proposal of how they will work, what the fees might be, and you have to compare those. So this might be a good point to say. Obviously, cost comes into this too. However, costs in the early stages seem to be quite comparable. It was really, really helpful to have those REBA stages, that they break down each build. Obviously, an architect's involvement can just be in those early stages, or it can be right through the build, and there will be different costs attached. We came into one of those situations where the last stages were where things really varied. One of the architects had a percentage-based fee, which you get really nervous about because we don't know how good we're going to be as clients as well. What if we start changing the build in some respects? So this was a percentage of the build cost. It's very difficult when you're looking at a percentage. Can we actually say where we're going to be on this? Because we're first timers too. We're coming into this, so a fixed fee was definitely a nicer thing to be looking at, to say, well, we can definitely get to that position. So it was the latter stages. There's something I want to investigate in another podcast as well about the principal designer position, which I don't fully understand. It's something to do with health and safety, which back in the olden days, perhaps the architect could keep an eye on site, but now I think I'm right in saying this, it's almost all or nothing. So I'm deviating a little bit here, but looking at those costs together, we get a sense of what you might get. This is actually another area where I felt a little bit funny, because one of the architects was a solo architect, or perhaps maybe had two people in the office, and the others were more architecture firms where they have a number of people in their offices. And it's difficult to know, isn't it? What choice is better? Do you go for the solo architect? Perhaps they'll be more attentive, may even get things done quicker. But the reverse could equally be true, that bigger company processes work better, or maybe they don't. So there are some unknown factors here in which way would be better, a larger firm or that solo architect. And also quite a difficult one when it comes to the design. What if you don't like the design of the solo architect? There's no one to fall back in or other input. You just have to work around it that way. So you don't want to almost put that architect in a difficult position, although I understand that's the job, really, isn't it? And one interesting thing about our solo architect was that he was part of the 1540 Collective, which is a group of, I think it's 6 architects, well, perhaps 7, all people that I know and like and trust anyway. And I think that's almost a mastermind situation where if they have difficulties, or perhaps they're looking for some capacity, then that is a good way to call on this collective. I really like that idea. I don't know whether more solo architects perhaps plug into this philosophy, but that did seem good. Anyway, just some more things to mull over and think about. At this point, we have to appoint our architect. As I mentioned, I'm pretty confident that no matter which way our decision went, we would have received a good outcome. In fact, when I was chatting to the 2 architecture firms that obviously didn't get selected, I said, you can stay anonymous if you want to. I totally understand. And it really actually meant something to me that they said, no, you can mention this in the podcast. That's absolutely fine. Almost a reflection on their character, and something saying you were right to pick them and shortlist them. You know, I'd love to work with them another time. So let's get to this. We decided to go with Parsons and Whitley, headed up by Chris Parsons, who's not in fact an architect. John will be the architect on this project. But this is what's quite interesting, because Chris always talks about his position is more on strategy and planning and all these things. I quite like that. That resonated with me. I've obviously, as I mentioned earlier, I've visited lots of projects and I've spoken to many happy people, whether it be for social housing or self-builders, and just seen the quality of the workmanship, which I think is very high. So that's the way that we decided to go. Perhaps the unusual fact here is for something that's just nagging me, which is my wife doesn't like new buildings. I've pushed her into this. I know, and I've probably talked about this before, although maybe not for some time. we always used to have the same idea of our ideal home. It would be a pretty little cottage in the countryside. And gradually that idea I've moved away from as I've learnt more and more. So I think we both want the same thing on the inside, and we like modern day living. We'd have a kitchen that would be quite open plan into a dining room area stroke living room area that's just all in one big space, because we just like that interaction and that everyone's in the same room. I love cooking. On the outside though, it doesn't quite translate. I like those big windows. I am not a fan of mullions or window bars or whatever you call them across the windows. I like a window. A window is something you should see through. Learning that fact that all the mullions existed in the past because they wanted bigger windows. They just couldn't make big windows. So what did they do? They put lots of small pieces of glass together. That's quite an interesting one, because when you look from the outside in, I would probably agree that it does look nicer sometimes to have those mullions, and it just adds a little bit of character. But in my mind now, it's pointless. So things like this are going to become a challenge on our project. I don't want us to turn into the nightmare clients. I think it could happen, but that's another reason going with Chris. I don't know. I just get the impression that we're still on a journey here, and I think that he can say the right thing or just help us through some of these difficulties of designing a house that we all want. While architecture is important, and I'd love to draw some influence from that farm my ancestors used to run, this is their land, that would be great. However, this is really about creating a house that we all love. And at this stage, I don't think that's straightforward. In some respects, I'm happy to take a back seat on what it looks like from the outside, because for me, it's more about the inside, how we're using that house, having that healthy, comfortable passive house environment. That is the major win for me in all of this. And from the outside, I'm more open. But I think we're going to return to this in future sessions, because as I see it, it is the big challenge of the build. And I feel that working with Chris, hopefully, sorry Chris if you're listening to this, hopefully you can handle this. You can point us in the right direction, educate us where we need to be educated. And I must admit, I am just really looking forward to this ride, really looking forward to moving the project on and sharing everything as we go. Funnily enough, just before I started recording this episode, I was having a look in the hub, and David Reed, who's doing his build up in Scotland, I was just looking at his progress. He's at exactly the same time, maybe just a touch behind, but going through that selection process of the various different architects and just reading what he's written as well. It's strangely comforting to know and to hear it's not all straightforward. He's managed to knock it down from 3 to 2 people that he's going to pick through, and he's been out on site and chatted to the architects, looks at some projects. So doing some great work. Well done, David. If you found today's podcast episode interesting, that's probably a good thing, because we'll be having more like this as I just share some thoughts with you as I go along. I'm only saying these are my thoughts. It's not, this is the way you should do it, but I just quite enjoy getting it off my chest. It's therapeutic as we do this. And I'd also like you to feed back in today's show notes, which is why I have put a question in there. Actually, let's make it 2 questions, because it will depend where you are. If you're coming into this and perhaps you're at the stage of selecting an architect or designer, I want to know, what else will you be doing as part of your quest? What have you been listening to this episode? Ben, you've missed out this major da-da-da-da-da. So that's what I want you to fill in the show notes. You just scroll down to the bottom. Or perhaps you've gone past this stage and you think some great tips would be, then also can you get onto the show notes and type that in. What we'll do is we'll link up to Parsons and Whitley, to Chris on Twitter, to Eco Design Consultants, who we mentioned earlier, to Good Architecture, all in today's show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/161. My call to action is to get yourself on the VIP early bird list for the hub, because enrolment is currently closed. It will be reopening at some point in spring 2017, so we're heading towards that, and I would love you to become a member. This will be such an exciting time to go through our projects together, and I would love to do that Clearly in the hub, one of the reasons I created it is because I run a production company and I felt there's a lot that could be done with video, but it's quite difficult to fund. Even as an insider, video is just expensive and time consuming and it just takes a bit to get together. But that's what I wanted to bring to the hub. So we've got those 2 case studies in there. Buckinghamshire Passivhaus, which we just had another video a couple of days ago about the basement going in, and Longbarrow Passivhaus. Not far down the line, there will be another case study to add as this project takes off. So you'll be able to see some footage of the build coming together. We always try and focus on the decisions that are being made in the videos. It's grand designs broken up into pieces, but not all the drama, more the decision making. Just trying to understand it. Maybe you would make different decisions, but at least if you can get your head around why some of these decisions are being made for that specific person, hopefully things will become easier for you on your project. What else? We've got the progress calls where we bring the community together, chat through some of the issues that we're facing, the learning modules which try to lay out step by step some of this process, and we're open to the fact that they will always be enhanced, or if we work out a better way to convey the information, or even if we can communicate the message quicker, that's what we'll always try to do there. We've got the private members forum, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Get yourself onto the waiting list. Next time, how do you fancy being a fly on the wall? Why don't you join our briefing with Chris? We go through some of the things that we'd like from our house, discuss some of the challenges that we're likely to face. Don't worry, it won't be the entire 2.5 hours or however long it was. We'll just give you some highlights from that session, but some interesting conversations came out of it. So I hope you can join me next time. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.